Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zeinab Badawi. The Hamas-Israeli ceasefire in Gaza has allowed Palestinians time to assess the cost of the Israeli offensive, both in human lives and damage to buildings and facilities. Close on 2,000 died, nearly all civilians, and thousands more are injured, many seriously. My guest today is Mads Gilbert, a Norwegian doctor just back from Gaza, where he works as a volunteer at the main Al-Shifa hospital. He is also an outspoken political activist on behalf of the Palestinian cause. Does this interfere with his work as a medic and humanitarian? Dr. Mads Gilbert, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you so much.
Give us a brief portrait of a typical 24-hour day in Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza in the past few weeks.
Really, that portrait should have been given by one of the Palestinian doctors who are the real heroes in Gaza. The doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the volunteers. But I'll try to give you a little impression. It's all depending on the rhythm of the Israeli bombing. We hear the bombs falling, we can see more or less where the direction is, we hear the ambulances and the cars come running in, and then there is a huge caseload, a mass casualty every time coming in, from 40 to 400 sometimes. Children, elders, women, civilians, all of them. They're bleeding, some of them are seriously injured, some of them are dying actually, some of them only have some few smaller wounds. Then you have to sort them, you have to stabilize those who are critically injured, and the senior surgeons, of whom Shifa has 220 surgeons alone, have to find out which patient will need life-saving immediate surgery. And this is extremely demanding.
You're literally trying to decide who you might help, who might live and who might die.
Exactly, because in this kind of situation, you don't have the capacity to treat everybody. So you have to choose those who have a chance of surviving. And bear in mind that Al-Shifa hospital, along with the rest of the healthcare system in Gaza, is suffering severely from the 7 years of siege and blockade. They are lacking everything: drugs, equipment, modern machinery, even, trolleys and respirators to treat the patient with. So it's an extremely demanding situation. In a disaster situation, you expect the hospitals to take care of this. But in Gaza, the hospitals are also disaster sceneries.
You just got back last month from Gaza. You were preparing a report for the United Nations relief agency, UNRWA, and you talked about the almost inhuman workload on the staff, the Palestinian staff, the doctors and the nurses, the ambulance drivers. Give us an idea of the kind of pressures they're under.
Well, they are in a sort of a double role, because they are also inhabitants of Gaza. Their houses are being bombed, their families are being injured and killed, and on top of that, they have not had any normal salaries for the last year, actually, due to the dispute between the Israeli, politics of not allowing the Palestinians to pay the so-called Hamas-employed staff in the healthcare system from 2006. So they are working for nothing. For the last 3 months, they have not had their salaries. And this is extremely demanding. So they're running triple shifts. They are exhausted, but they stand tall. They are extremely courageous, I would say. They stand their calls. They don't leave. And some of them, painful enough, they have their own family members coming in. Brothers, children, God forbid, dead or dying in some instances, but all the time they're listening to the local radio to sort of be monitoring where are the bombs falling. Very high professional level. The Palestinians are known to be very well educated, and so is the healthcare system. But what could have been a state-of-the-art university hospital, Shifa, is a very, very worn out and sort of exhausted hospital today.
Talking of state-of-the-art, you're from Norway, the world's richest country. You've worked there. How do you feel when you are operating in these very depleted, difficult circumstances in Gaza, when you know just what you could do to help patients if you had the means?
First of all, I feel this despair that I think I share with the Palestinians and many people, that all this could have been avoided if the bombing had stopped and the siege had been lifted. All this is unnecessary suffering, the killing, the death, the injuries. I feel, you know, this is not a natural disaster. This is not an earthquake. This is not a tsunami. This is all planned and man-made, which makes it extremely difficult on an emotional and a moral level, and also on a professional medical level, to accept all this suffering. So many are children, so many, 1/3 of the injured and killed are children. I've never seen so many injured and dying children in my life. And that alone is a huge emotional toll on any medical system, let alone a system which is so much drained of resources.
You've made a direct appeal to President Obama. You said, Mr. Obama, do you have a heart? I invite you to spend one night, just one night, with us in Shifa Hospital. I am convinced 100% this would change history. What do you mean by that?
I mean that, of course, Obama has a heart. And I think that the distance between the sharp end of the military solutions of conflicts, that is the suffering on the ground among civilian, you know, people like you and me, that distance has become so far that the politicians don't ever get confronted with the amount of suffering.
But they're aware of what's going on. I mean, Obama says that he's deeply concerned, he has said, about the risks of further escalation and the loss of more innocent life. The US State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki has said of one particular Israeli shelling on a UN facility that they were appalled by this disgraceful shelling. And she says the suspicion that militants are operating nearby does not justify strikes that put at risk the lives of so many innocent civilians. So why do you feel that the suffering that you've described is not sufficiently acknowledged by international leaders?
That statement is with one part of the mouth. The other part of the mouth is saying we will support Israel with more weapons and more money. And the military support from the US to Israel is the fundament of all these military actions. So it's a very double-tongued, double-standard kind of statement. But of course, it's correct. These are violations of international law, gross violations of international law. They should be stopped by the international community. And I think, as a doctor and as a human being, that the Israeli impunity is a huge moral problem for US in particular.
It's not just the US, but the European Union, the United Nations all say Israel has a right to self-defense, and that if there are rockets fired from Gaza into Israel, which terrorizes the population there, and indeed a handful of citizens, civilians, have died, the vast majority of the 70, of course, were Israeli soldiers. And what the Israelis say when civilian infrastructure is damaged, they say, well, look, the militants operate from these civilian buildings. Can you be sure, for example, having worked at Al-Shifa, that there weren't militants operating from there?
I haven't been in every corner of Shifa, but I've been there for many years, and I've never seen any militants, armed people in Shifa. I know that the Palestinians know the rules of the war quite well. But when all this rhetoric about Israel having the right to protect themselves, when you are an occupant and you're shooting at the occupied people, then the occupied people have a right to defend themselves. So it's sort of taking language hostage also. All the sort of the core principle of international law are being turned around. I think that the Palestinians, and I don't support Hamas, I don't support Fatah or any fraction, I support the Palestinian people and their right to resist occupation, like we did.
By firing rockets?
They have to use the weapons they see fit, but as long, I mean...
By firing rockets, so you think that's okay for the Palestinians to resist occupation in that way?
I condemn any targeting of civilian targets, be it in Gaza or in Israel. There has so far been killed almost 1,900 Palestinians and 3 civilian Israelis. That says everything about the proportionality or the disproportionality of the use of weapons. It is not the Palestinians who are killing the Israelis. It is actually the Israelis who are killing the Palestinians by the thousands.
But the Israelis' point is always, we regret the loss of civilian life, but we have to try to target these militants who are firing rockets at us, and they do use civilian infrastructure. The United Nations has itself said that 2 UNRWA schools were used as bases by the militants. They've confirmed this, so we know it goes on.
which I condemn, which everybody condemns, and that is not the big picture. That is not the overall picture.
I was making the point, let me tell you what an Israeli official says about Al-Shifa hospital where you've been working. We know that downstairs in the hospital there is a Hamas command and control centre and that Hamas leaders are hiding there. No reporter is allowed to go anywhere downstairs. They're only allowed to work upstairs, take pictures of casualties, the pictures that Hamas wants them to take.
We heard that in 2009. It was used as a sort of a threat to get us out of Shifa. We've heard it again in 2012 and now again in 2014. Show us, I mean, if they have proof, why don't they show the proof? This is only allegations, and Israeli intelligence is very efficient in showing, you know, pictures and proof. So far, it has not been shown. I have not seen, with my eyes, I have not seen armed militias in Shifa or in any other hospital. But the point is that when you are living in Gaza and you are going to exercise your right to resist occupation, from where will you do it? I mean, if Israel wants a pure military fight, why don't they just lift the siege and let the civilians flee or leave Gaza? The point about Gaza is that nobody is allowed to leave. And in such a condensed place, and during the last attack, 44% of the territory was taken and declared as a security zone. And you packed 1.8 million people into that small space. So there would always be a vicinity of something which could be defined as civilian. That does not mean, and I do not defend any action which is using the civilians, of course.
But you have made your opinions very, very well known, and I want to put this point to you, that do you somehow blur that line between humanitarian and political fields? Because you've been quoted as saying of the Gaza situation, my appeal is don't send bandages, don't send syringes, don't send medical teams. The most important medical thing you can now do is force Israel to stop the bombing and lift the siege of Gaza. Shouldn't you, as a doctor, just be more concerned with treating your patients in the short term, in the medium term, try to get them better and leave the politics to others?
No, medicine and politics are Siamese twins. Medicine and public health is all about living conditions for people, for ordinary people. Living conditions is about water, food, human security. It's about having education, a house, and a life. That is what creates health. Everything in Gaza that is threatening public health is concerned with the occupation and the bombing. And as a doctor, I have to not only treat, but I have to look at the prevention of what I'm treating. Prevention is always better than cure, as we know. And the overall and overruling and only causative factor of all the injuries we were seeing and treating in Shifa and in the other hospitals was the Israeli bombing and the siege. So, of course, I cannot be a doctor without addressing the political preconditions for all these injuries and all this suffering and death. I couldn't.
Well, you have made that point clear, and in fact you tweeted recently, if no siege, no tunnels, if no occupation, no rockets.
I think that's a good slogan.
That's what you said. So let me just pick up the siege first. Shimon Peres, who just stepped down as Israeli president last month, told the BBC this week, we withdrew from Gaza. We handed over to the Palestinians a free, open Gaza. They could have developed it for tourism, fishing, agriculture. We thought, why are you shooting at us? The people of Gaza are not our enemies. Hamas imposed themselves on them. OK, so that first point there, Gaza was free. There are no Jews living in Gaza. There's no occupation there. But what happened when the settlers left?
Who says there is no occupation? The Israeli government and army has full control of the land space, the airspace.
No siege. I was picking up the point that you made. Lift the siege. There was no siege originally.
The siege came in 2006.
Fairly early on.
When the Palestinian people, in a duly organized democratic election, the first one in any Arab state, by the way, which was actually asked to be organized by the quartet, Russia, UN, EU and the United States. They organized the election. Hamas won the election. They tried to make a unified government. It was shut down. Then came the siege, and it was, you know, increased and increased and increased as a collective punishment.
Sure. But what President Peres, the point he's making, is when the Jewish settlers did withdraw from Gaza and Gaza was left open, there wasn't a siege imposed straight away. Instantly, it was very clear that the Palestinians in Gaza, or at least some of them, the militants, were not going to leave
Israelis
alone?
Allow me to disagree with the President Shimon Peres, the late. It was a full...
The former.
He's
still with us, yes.
I'm sorry. It is still full control. It was still full Israeli control with the airspace, with the sea, with the borders, and with the electronic space. So the Palestinians in Gaza have never been
no, the occupation remains.
Exactly.
It was the siege. If it was the siege I was pointing out.
Why did the siege come? The siege came as a collective punishment because they had elected somebody they didn't like.
And there are efforts now. There are efforts in the international community do say, and the United Nations has said that the siege has impoverished the people of Gaza, and they are working to see if that can be lifted as some kind of political settlement. Okay, what about the rockets? You say if no occupation, no rockets.
Yeah.
But not all Palestinians don't all want to fire rockets. President Mahmoud Abbas from the Fatah faction said on Palestine TV on the 10th of July, without explicitly naming Hamas, what are you trying to achieve by sending rockets? We prefer to fight with wisdom and politics. So the Palestinians don't want rockets.
No, I was in Beirut in 1982 as a medical doctor during the Israeli invasion and siege and bombing of Beirut. Then it was the PLO and Yasser Arafat who was the terrorist, who was going to be killed. Like they are now going to kill the leadership in Hamas and you know, destroy all their structures, like they wanted with PLO in the 80s. Anybody who opposes the grand plan of the Israeli political government today, political Zionism, will be stamped as a terrorist and will be outlawed. The Palestinians have been under strict, hard, brutal Israeli rule and oppression for the last 70 years. And they have the right to defend themselves.
With rockets, but the point I'm making to you is that which Palestinians are you talking about? Which Palestinians are you talking about? You're talking about the militants. So when you say you support the Palestinian cause, you're actually supporting the militant Palestinian cause.
Right.
Because you see, I'll tell you what else President Abbas said. He called on all Palestinian factions to hold fire, he said, in the interest of the Palestinian people and their security, and to prevent giving Israel any pretext to continue its aggression on Gaza.
Well, every time there is a ceasefire, like after 2012, the 2012 attack, the preconditions for the ceasefire is broken by the Israelis. They did that in 2008 in November. That was a long-lasting ceasefire with nobody killed on either side. The following ceasefire after 2012 was broken. The siege was not lifted. And the Palestinians have good reason to be very suspicious about these preconditions because they do not include the simple 10 points that they have now as preconditions for a siege for for a ceasefire. A 10-year ceasefire. It is to lift the siege, it is to open the ports, to open the borders and give people a normal life in Gaza. How can I define by which weapons the Palestinians shall defend themselves? Because this is a defense, that is up to them. I don't support any militant fraction or any aggressive action. That's not the point. But the point is that everything is turned upside down all the time. It is actually de facto on the ground. It is Israel who is attacking, and the Palestinians are
Israel says it's defending itself.
I know, but that's the narrative of Israel. There is another narrative, and that is the narrative of the occupied people, the Palestinian people, and I, for one, have seen that narrative and lived that narrative, so I understand why they are defending their women, their children, their habitat and their communities.
I was making the point, though, that when you say if no occupation, no rockets, that actually there's a vast number, that mainstream Fatah faction that President Mahmoud Abbas leads, which actually says, don't fire the rockets in our name. Number one, we prefer peaceful means. And secondly, don't do that because it will give Israel, as President Abbas said, a pretext to continue their aggression on Gaza. Let me ask you this, though, Dr. Mads Gilbert, because you have worked with the Palestinian health sector since 1981. For the last 17 years, you've been visiting Gaza regularly, helping them build up their health infrastructure, helping with the training, the treating of people. As you said, you worked with the Palestinians in refugee camp hospitals during the conflict there between Israel, when Israel was in Lebanon. Why is the Palestinian cause so important to you when there is so much conflict and suffering all over the world? Why is it the Palestinian one?
I have been working in Burma and Cambodia and Angola also with different medical projects in the same context of solidarity medicine. But I think once you get to know the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian history, it tends to to affect you in a very maybe personal or a very in a moral way, I would say. I think that the world is completely belied to when it comes to who is right and who is wrong. And I think that once you sit down and you really get into the history of this dispossessed people and all the betrayal and all the attacks and all the suffering and all the losses they've had, and the overall ruling bodies of the world, the United States, EU, Israel, are treating them in such inhumane way and in such...
well, the occupation is recognised. The occupied territories are recognised as being occupied by the Israelis,
but nobody's
by the
doing
international
anything
community.
with it. And nothing happens. It's getting worse and worse by the day. And now I sensed in Shifa with my dear colleagues a change of opinion, a change of mental attitude. They said, we'd rather die now than to get another ceasefire which is going to cheat us, and we are going to be pushed further down the mud because we don't want to live as slaves in our own country. So I think the perception that this is only Israel against Hamas is totally wrong. This is a Palestinian people more united than ever before. And mind you, the coalition government now was the pretext for the attack on Gaza, I think. And many analysts think that. It had nothing to do with the rockets. It had to do with the fact that Israel...
Hamas and Fatah.
Yes, they made a new unity government 7 years after 2006, and Israel don't want a unified Palestinian counterpart.
Well, that is something that some Palestinians have said. But just listening to you, Dr. Gilbert, it is very clear, obviously, that you are a political activist. But does that interfere with your work as a humanitarian, as a medic? When you take, for instance, Médecins Sans Frontières, they operate in so many difficult situations all over the world. And what they said to Hard Talk is that, look, we do routinely speak out about violations whenever we see them, but we do not propose solutions or take an overt political position because it could potentially cut us off from accessing vulnerable people in certain areas. That kind of approach is very different from yours. MSF have a point, don't they?
Absolutely, like Red Cross and ICRC, they want to be on both sides, that's fine. I'm not, I mean, make it totally clear that if I should ever be exposed to an Israeli general being injured and an Israeli soldier, of course that individual patient would get exactly the same treatment as anybody else. That I think is clear. My decision is before that. I choose to go to Gaza and not to Israel. I have respect for the Médecins Sans Frontières and ICRC. I have chosen another way of working. I think that the people fighting against occupation and oppression, they need solidarity and more than lip service.
But you've paid a price, haven't you, for being outspoken in the past? And I have to bring this up because it's something that everybody knows, a lot of people know about you, is that after the September the 11th attacks in 2001, you made some comments which you have since really said that you no longer support. But just to remind you that what you said at the time about the September the 11th attacks is, you said, I'm upset by the terrorist attack, but I'm at least as upset over the suffering that the US has caused. It is in this context that 5,000 dead has been seen. If the US government has a legitimate right to bomb and kill civilians in Iraq, the oppressed have a moral right to attack the US. And you were criticised for sounding as though you were condoning the September the 11th attacks. You've paid a price for being outspoken.
As you know, I have 4, 5, 6, 7 times denounced that interview and the content of it. I denounce and I absolutely condemn any attack on civilian targets from anybody. So that's totally clear. But I think that with the power distribution in the world today, poor people, not only in Palestine and in other parts of the global south, are suffering from a new colonial wave of oppression, which is coming precisely from the United States. And they support the Israeli colonial project. And I think we need to speak up against that, because at the end of the day, if we allow power to define right, if we allow might to be the tool of solving conflicts which are just in its cause, then we are all degenerating the kind of organized world we try to create. Respect for international law, totally omitted by Israel. Respect for the UN Charter, totally omitted by Israel. We need, all of us, to stand up against this degeneration of the international order, I think.
Dr. Mads Gilbert, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.